In the first video of this series, I gave a brief introduction to the consensus view of Unitarian and Universalist history. Now I'd like to re-examine this consensus view from the point of view of women and non-white people. You may have noticed that the consensus view of UU history focuses on the role of men. More specifically, it focuses on the role of white men. If we want to get even more specific, it's mostly white male ministers of predominantly Anglo-Saxon ancestry. You may have also noticed that the consensus view of history focuses on ministers. And indeed, most of the ministers mentioned are well-educated and can be situated in the middle class, upper middle class, or upper class. So, where are the women in this account? We know from statistical studies of American church membership that at least half and usually a majority of members or participants in an American congregation are women. So we know that there must be Unitarian and Universalist women. This was a big question that began to be asked during the feminist revolution that shook Unitarian Universalism from the 1970s through the 1980s. Who were the Universalist and Unitarian women? One result of asking this question was a whole subgenre of biographies of Unitarian and Universalist women. The Unitarian Universalist Women's Federation, or UUWF, formed in 1963 from the merger of the Unitarian and the Universalist women's groups, has done a great deal of work on this topic. The UUWF and others have made a point that too often denominational history becomes his story, his story, a single dominant narrative that belongs to men. The UUWF on its current website instead refers to her stories. Notice that this term is both feminine and plural. You can find a good collection of well-researched biographies of Unitarian and Universalist women at the Unitarian Universalist History and Heritage Society's online dictionary of UU biography. But what I'd like to do is to highlight a couple of her stories that may help make a larger point, and I'll start with Eliza Tupper Wilkes and end with Sophia Lyon Foss. So Eliza Tupper was born in Maine in 1842, the daughter of a Baptist minister. By 1867, while teaching school in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, she rejected her Baptist upbringing and became a Universalist. She was encouraged to become a preacher by the local Universalist minister, a woman named Augusta Chapin, one of the first women to be ordained by the Universalists. Eliza Tupper began preaching soon thereafter, and she soon married a law clerk named William Wilkes. Now known as Eliza Tupper Wilkes, she began serving the Rochester, Minnesota Universalist Church in 1870, and that congregation ordained her in 1871. She and William moved to Colorado Territory, and the birth of 5 children in quick succession meant that she didn't do much preaching or other ministry for a couple of decades, really. However, she was very active in various community groups and continued to be active in those community groups when the family with their young children moved to Sioux Falls in Dakota Territory. In the mid-1880s, Wilkes found her true calling. Though by now she was an experienced pastor and by all accounts a good preacher, she proved to be particularly gifted at starting new Universalist congregations. She founded congregations in many cities and towns through Minnesota, the Dakotas, and Iowa. By 1890, the combination of middle age and her intense work schedule began to catch up with her, and Wilkes began to spend winters in California. This led to her being appointed as assistant minister to the Oakland, California Unitarian Church, while also serving as what we today call a church planter throughout Northern California. It is worth noting that that portion of Wilkes' salary devoted to church planting was paid for with funds raised by Unitarian women. In May 1895, she visited Stanford University, where she was the first woman to preach at Stanford's Memorial Church. Then in the fall of 1895, she began organizing a lay-led congregation in Palo Alto. Although this congregation only lasted a couple of years, it formed a nucleus of Unitarians who organized a later church that lasted from 1905 to 1934, and several members of that church were in turn instrumental in forming our present congregation. Thus, our congregation can trace its roots back to the preaching and organizing of Eliza Tupper Wilkes. Yet when I first arrived here 11 years ago, the history, I was told, revolved mostly around men. I was told about Sidney Bruce Snow, the first minister of the 1905 Unitarian Church, and I was told innumerable stories about Dan Lyon, the male minister of the present congregation from about 1948 to the early 1970s. In spite of the fact that we Unitarian Universalists are all good feminists, the crucial role of this inspiring woman, of Eliza Tupper Wilkes, tended to be passed over. Even today, Wilkes is not mentioned in the official history of our congregation's website. So that's the first her story. My second her story is shorter and more pointed. Much of the history we Unitarian Universalists tell about ourselves involve theological clashes between white male ministers. Theodore Parker and Ralph Waldo Emerson proclaimed transcendentalism and joined battle with the older Unitarians led by William Ellery Channing. John Dietrich proclaimed humanism, which annoyed the old guard theists like Dan Huntington Fenn, and these two forces joined battle. And today I suppose we could say that the new anti-racist theology is deconstructing the old racist implications of Unitarian Universalist theology, and the advocates of anti-racism are heroically battling against systemic racism. So personally, I'm a strong supporter of anti-racist theologies, but as a feminist, I'm wary of patriarchal metaphors that rely on battles. However, I believe the most important theological story of the 20th century has been largely ignored. That story involves no controversy, no battles, and it happened in what was considered mostly a woman's world. Sophia Lyon Fahs began working for the Unitarians in 1937 at age 61, and over the next couple of decades she developed what were known as the New Beacon series of curriculum books. One of the titles she developed and wrote, From Long Ago in Many Lands, by the way, will be used in our online Sunday school class this year, nearly 70 years after its first publication. Fahs had an outside influence on the theology of Unitarianism and later Unitarian Universalism. Her curriculum books promulgated a theology of religious naturalism. She excluded material that required a supernatural interpretation and included material that could be interpreted through natural phenomena. Many older Unitarian Universalist ministers were taught these curriculums as children, and whether they are theists or humanists, they all tend to interpret the world without resorting to much in the way of supernatural explanations. Fahs's influence has been forgotten, I suspect, both because she was a woman and because she was involved in children's education, which is women's work. Because you see, patriarchy still tells us that serious theology is not done by women, nor can it be done with children. So, where are all the Unitarian and Universalist women? They're there, but their contributions have been perceived often as mere women's work, not worthy of serious attention. Even today, in our supposedly enlightened era, patriarchy retains a good deal of its power. Now I'm going to turn to African Americans as representative of non-white people within Unitarianism and Universalism in the United States. This part of our history, the presence of African Americans in Unitarianism and Universalism, was almost completely ignored until 1980 when Mark Morrison Reed published his doctoral thesis under the title of Black Pioneers in a White Denomination. Mark's thesis documented Egbert Ethelred Brown, who tried to start Unitarian movements in Jamaica and Harlem in the early 20th century, and Lewis McGee and his founding of the Free Religious Fellowship, a black Unitarian congregation on the south side of Chicago. Mark also documented how both these men were poorly treated and even actively undermined by the American Unitarian Association. That first edition of his book, with a picture of him looking very young on the back, was really quite explosive in the denomination at that time. In the third edition of Mark's book, published in 1994, he expanded his original text and added an appendix with a complete list of African American Unitarian Universalist ministers up to the date of publication. This appendix contained only 30 names. Mark states that at that time, only a little over 1% of all Unitarian Universalist ministers were black. That corresponded to the percentage of all black Unitarian Universalists, which in 1994 stood at about 1.3%. What Mark's book brings home to me is quite simple. We often tell our Unitarian Universalist history as an intellectual history. Here are all these people down through the ages that affirm Unitarianism as a theological stance. Here are all these people that affirm Universalism as a theological stance. We're all Unitarians and Universalists and all in this together. But this is simply not true. Mark points to the story of, for example, William Jackson, the minister of a black church with over 200 members who attended the annual meeting of the Unitarians in 1860. Jackson told this all-white meeting of Unitarians that he had become convinced of the truth of Unitarianism and would like to bring his congregation into the Unitarian denomination. He was, as Mark puts it, given the cold shoulder. In the interest of full disclosure, Mark invited me to write an essay about William Jackson for his 2011 anthology, Darkening the Doorways, Black Trailblazers and Missed Opportunities in Unitarian Universalism. So, supposedly all these people are all Unitarians and Universalists, yet the blacks get ejected from Unitarianism and Universalism. What's going on? To help explain this phenomenon, Mark quotes the Unitarian historian Earl Morse Wilbur, who said that Unitarians were historically, quote, disposed to be complacent and self-confident and felt moved by no eager desire to make converts to their religion or to urge it upon others, close quote. This continues to be true today. I've seen Unitarian Universalists engage in behavior that has the effect of actively discouraging non-white persons to stay in our congregation. This includes our congregation. Typical of such behaviors is asking non-white people, "Where are you from?" with the implication that it must be from someplace besides America. Also common is when white people say to non-white people, "You speak English without an accent," which implies surprise, either that the non-white person speaks in a college-educated accent or that the non-white person speaks colloquial native English. White people often ask these questions in all innocence, but you can only be innocent of the unsavory implications of these questions if you are white, and no one ever questions your right to be an American citizen. In this light, Mark Morrison Reed also points out another uncomfortable truth. He says, "Let us not fool ourselves. Ours is an upper middle class religion." Thus, Mark says, Unitarian Universalism is only going to be successful at reaching out to non-white people when there is a substantial number of upper middle class non-white people in those communities where there's a large pool of upper middle class college-educated non-white people. That also means that our religious history has to take account of the socioeconomic status of Unitarian Universalists and how our status, on average, relates to the status of the general population that we live in. There's a lot more to say on both race and sex as it relates to Unitarian Universalism, and I've barely touched on the class bias of Unitarian Universalism, and I've passed over other challenging historical questions like sexual orientation. For example, when were the first same-sex marriage ceremonies performed by Unitarian Universalist ministers? But I'll have to save those topics for another time. For in my next video, I'll be addressing yet another aspect of Unitarian Universalist history.